The rain hammered against the glass walls of the Ferrari dealership with such force that each droplet sounded like a tiny explosion. Inside, the showroom gleamed under harsh LED lights that reflected off polished Italian metal and marble floors so pristine they looked like mirrors. The air carried that distinct scent of new leather mixed with expensive cologne and the faint chemical smell of tire rubber. In the corner, near a blood-red SF-90 Stradale that cost more than most people's houses, stood a man who didn't look like he belonged there at all. Marcus Chen was 40 years old, with the kind of athletic build that came from years of boxing in run-down gyms rather than polished fitness centers. His leather jacket had seen better days, scuffed at the elbows, the zipper slightly crooked, and his jeans were the practical kind you bought at department stores, not boutiques. A shadow of stubble darkened his jaw, and his eyes, dark and serious, seemed to absorb everything around him without giving anything away. He stood perfectly still, hands in his pockets, watching a salesman flutter around a silver-haired executive like a moth around a flame. Before we go any further, let me ask you something real quick. This channel is pushing hard to hit that first big milestone of 1,000 subscribers, and honestly, every single person who joins makes a massive difference. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that button right now. Drop a like on this video to help it reach more people, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I love knowing where this story is traveling. Your support keeps this content alive. Now let's get back to Marcus and what happened next in that dealership. The executive was everything Marcus wasn't. His charcoal suit probably cost $5,000, tailored so perfectly it moved with him like a second skin. His silver hair was swept back with product that caught the light, and when he moved, a cloud of expensive cologne followed, something with notes of sandalwood and leather that probably came in a crystal bottle. He gestured broadly as he spoke, his voice carrying across the showroom with the kind of authority that came from decades of commanding boardrooms and bending people to his will. Marcus had been standing there for 20 minutes, waiting patiently for someone to acknowledge him. He'd made eye contact with 3 different salespeople, but each time they'd glanced at his worn jacket and scuffed boots, their eyes had slid away like oil on water. The executive, however, had been attended to the moment he'd walked through the door, even though he'd arrived 15 minutes after Marcus. The salesman, a thin man in his 30s named Derek, with wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose, was practically trembling with eagerness as he showed the executive a Roma Spider convertible. The car was gunmetal grey with a tan interior that looked soft enough to sleep on, and the price tag hanging from the rearview mirror showed a number that made Derek's voice go up an octave every time he mentioned it. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, the movement causing his leather jacket to creak. The sound was barely audible over the rain and the salesman's enthusiastic pitch, but somehow the executive heard it. He turned, his pale blue eyes landing on Marcus with the kind of look you'd give to something you'd found stuck to your shoe. The executive's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. He took 2 steps toward Marcus, close enough that his cologne became almost overpowering, mixing unpleasantly with the leather and rubber smells that already filled the space. When he spoke, his voice was clipped and precise, each word delivered like a small blade. He told Marcus to step aside, addressing him as if he were an employee blocking the way. The words came out with such casual dismissiveness that they seemed to hang in the air for a moment, crystallizing the assumption that someone in a worn jacket couldn't possibly be a customer. He gestured with one manicured hand, waving Marcus away like he was clearing smoke, and turned back to Derek without waiting for a response. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that the words had landed. He didn't move. His hands stayed in his pockets, his feet planted exactly where they'd been, and his dark eyes remained fixed on the executive's back with an intensity that would have made most people uncomfortable if they'd been paying attention. Derek's face had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. His eyes darted between Marcus and the executive, clearly torn between correcting his wealthy customer and avoiding confrontation. After a moment of visible internal struggle, he made his choice. Derek straightened his spine, adjusted his glasses with trembling fingers, and cleared his throat. He addressed the executive with careful politeness, explaining that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. The words came out stilted and nervous, but he pushed through, saying that the gentleman in the leather jacket was actually also a valued customer who had been waiting patiently for assistance. The executive turned slowly, his eyebrows rising with theatrical surprise. He looked Marcus up and down again, this time more deliberately, taking in every detail from the scuffed boots to the faded jeans to the jacket that had clearly seen years of wear. When his eyes finally met Marcus's face, his expression was pure condescension. He asked Derek, his voice dripping with skepticism, if this gentleman was perhaps interested in their pre-owned vehicles or maybe their financing options. The implication hung heavy in the air that someone dressed like Marcus couldn't possibly afford anything on this showroom floor without significant help. The tension in the room had become almost physical, like the air pressure before a storm. Two other salespeople had stopped what they were doing, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they sensed something unfolding. Near the glass wall, where the rain continued its relentless assault, a young couple pretending to examine a Portofino had gone quiet, their attention now completely focused on the developing situation. Derek's face had progressed from pale to almost grey. His hand went to his tie, adjusting it nervously, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to almost a whisper. He told the executive with obvious reluctance that actually this particular customer had been scheduled for a special appointment and that the general manager would be arriving shortly to handle the matter personally. The executive's expression shifted from condescension to confusion, then to something that might have been concern. His posture changed subtly, becoming less expansive, his shoulders pulling in slightly. He glanced at Marcus again, this time with a flicker of uncertainty in those pale blue eyes. Marcus still hadn't moved. He stood like a statue carved from stone, his face an unreadable mask. But there was something in his stillness that spoke louder than words. It was the stillness of someone who had nothing to prove because he already knew his worth. The kind of stillness that came from supreme confidence or supreme indifference, it was impossible to tell which. The showroom's front door opened with a hydraulic hiss, and a man stepped in from the rain. He was tall and lean, with dark-rimmed glasses that gave him an intellectual air, and he moved with the rigid posture of someone who spent their days managing difficult situations and difficult people. His suit was impeccable but understated, expensive without being flashy, and when he swept the water from his shoulders, his movements were economical and precise. This was James Morrison, the general manager of the Ferrari dealership, and the moment he entered, the entire energy of the room shifted. It was subtle but unmistakable, like the way animals respond when a predator enters their territory. Derek immediately straightened further, if that was even possible, and the other salespeople suddenly found urgent reasons to look busy. James's eyes scanned the showroom with practiced efficiency, taking in the scene in seconds. His gaze moved from Derek's panicked expression to the executive's confusion to Marcus's unwavering calm, and something that might have been recognition flickered across his face. He walked forward with purposeful strides that echoed on the marble floor, his shoes making sharp clicking sounds that cut through the ambient noise of rain and hushed conversations. When he reached the group, James nodded politely at the executive, acknowledging him with professional courtesy, but nothing more. Then he turned to Marcus, and his entire demeanor changed. His rigid posture softened slightly, and his voice when he spoke carried a warmth that hadn't been there a moment before. He addressed Marcus with genuine respect, apologizing for the delay and asking if he'd been waiting long. There was no servile fawning in his tone, no exaggerated deference, just the kind of easy professionalism that came from dealing with genuinely important clients who didn't need their egos stroked. The executive's face had begun to change color, a flush creeping up from his collar to his carefully groomed hairline. His confident stance had started to crumble, shoulders hunching slightly as realization began to dawn. Derek had taken 2 steps back, as if trying to remove himself from the situation entirely, and his glasses had slipped down his nose again, but he didn't bother to adjust them. Marcus finally moved, pulling one hand from his pocket to check his watch. A simple piece, nothing ostentatious, but the way he wore it suggested it meant something to him. He told James, his voice low and measured, that he'd been there about 25 minutes, but that he understood they were busy. There was no accusation in his tone, no hint of complaint, just a statement of fact delivered with the same calm that had characterized his entire presence. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He glanced at Derek, and that single look conveyed more than an hour of shouting could have accomplished. Derek seemed to shrink further, his face now matching the grey of the Roma spider behind him. The general manager turned back to Marcus and assured him that they would handle his needs immediately, gesturing toward the back of the showroom where a private consultation room waited with its glass walls and leather furniture. The executive cleared his throat, a strangled sound that drew everyone's attention. His pale blue eyes had widened, and his carefully maintained expression of superiority had completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. He started to say something, perhaps an apology, perhaps an explanation, but James cut him off with a raised hand and a look that could have frozen water. James told the executive, his voice professionally cool, that Derek would be happy to continue assisting him in just a moment, once they'd addressed Mr. Chen's requirements. The formal use of Marcus's name landed like a bomb in the conversation, confirming what the executive had already begun to suspect, that he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. As James guided Marcus toward the consultation room, he mentioned, almost casually, that they'd prepared everything for the final paperwork on Mr. Chen's purchase. He added, his voice carrying just enough volume to reach interested ears, that the LaFerrari Aperta they'd been holding for him had arrived from Italy the previous week and was currently in their secure garage, waiting for final inspection before delivery. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. A LaFerrari Aperta. Not just any Ferrari, but one of the most exclusive, expensive and rare vehicles the company had ever produced. A car that cost over $2 million when it was new and now commanded prices that could reach $4 million or more on the collector's market. A car that couldn't simply be bought. You had to be invited to purchase one, selected by Ferrari itself based on your history with the brand and your standing in the automotive collecting community. The executive's face had progressed from flushed to completely pale, all the blood seeming to drain away as understanding crashed over him like the rain hammering the windows. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no sound came out. His expensive cologne suddenly seemed cloying and excessive, filling the air around him like evidence of his own pretension. Derek had pressed himself against the Roma spider, as if trying to merge with it and disappear entirely. The other salespeople had frozen in place, witnesses to a moment that would be retold in the break room for years to come. The young couple by the window had given up any pretense of looking at cars and were now openly staring, their eyes wide with fascination. Marcus paused at the entrance to the consultation room, turning back to survey the showroom one last time. His expression hadn't changed, still that same unreadable calm, those same dark eyes that gave nothing away. But there was something in his posture now, a subtle shift that spoke of satisfaction, of justice quietly served without fanfare or drama. The executive took a step forward, his mouth working as he tried to find words that might undo what had been done. His hand came up in a gesture that was half plea, half explanation, and his voice, when it finally emerged, was nothing like the commanding tone he'd used earlier. It came out thin and reedy, stripped of all authority, as he tried to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, that he hadn't realized, that he simply assumed based on appearances. James turned to face him, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes hard as diamonds behind his dark-rimmed glasses. He informed the executive, in tones of Arctic courtesy, that Marcus Chen was not only purchasing the LaFerrari Aperta, but also owned 3 other Ferraris currently in his private collection, an Enzo, an F40, and a 288 GTO. He was, James continued with quiet emphasis, one of their most important clients and a significant collector whose relationship with the brand spanned over 15 years. The information landed like successive blows, each revelation hammering home the magnitude of the executive's error. These weren't just cars. They were automotive legends, pieces of history worth millions of dollars combined. The 288 GTO alone was one of the most sought-after Ferraris ever made, with pristine examples selling for over $3 million at auction. Marcus finally spoke, addressing the executive directly for the first time. His voice was quiet, but carried easily across the marble floor, cutting through the sound of rain and shocked silence. He told the executive that he'd learned a long time ago, in a boxing gym on the south side of Chicago where he grew up, that you couldn't judge a person's worth by their appearance. He'd been wearing these same types of clothes when he'd started his first software company in his garage 20 years ago, and he saw no reason to change now just because the bank balance had a few more zeros. The words were delivered without malice or triumph, just stated as simple facts, but they had more impact than any angry tirade could have achieved. They revealed not just wealth, but the journey that had created it, a journey that clearly hadn't included the country clubs and prep schools that had shaped the executive's worldview. Derek had finally found his voice, stammering an apology that tripped over itself in its desperation to convey sincerity. He assured Marcus that this had never happened before, that the dealership standards were much higher, that he personally felt terrible about the situation. His hands were shaking as he adjusted his glasses for the 10th time, and sweat had begun to bead on his forehead, despite the air conditioning that kept the showroom at a perfect 70 degrees. James cut off Derek's rambling with a single sharp gesture, then turned his full attention back to Marcus. He asked in tones that suggested the answer was merely a formality if Mr. Chen still wished to proceed with the purchase, or if perhaps, given the circumstances, he'd prefer to take his business elsewhere. The question was delivered with perfect professionalism, but there was an undercurrent of genuine concern. Losing a client like Marcus would be more than just a failed sale. It would be a significant blow to the dealership's reputation and relationships. Marcus considered for a moment, his dark eyes moving from James to Derek to the executive, who stood frozen like a deer in headlights, his expensive suit suddenly looking less impressive and more like a costume. The entire showroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his decision. Finally, Marcus nodded slightly, telling James that he'd come to complete a purchase, and he intended to do exactly that. However, he added with the faintest hint of something that might have been amusement, perhaps Derek could handle the executive's needs while James personally managed the LaFerrari transaction. It was a graceful solution that allowed the situation to move forward, while making clear that the hierarchy had been definitively established. James allowed himself a small smile, the first genuine expression that had crossed his face since entering. He assured Marcus that would be absolutely no problem, and invited him to follow into the consultation room where they could handle everything in comfort and privacy. As they walked away, James placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, not in a familiar way, but with the kind of respect reserved for equals, and began discussing delivery arrangements and the custom specifications Marcus had ordered months ago. Behind them, Derek turned to the executive with an expression that had transformed from panic to carefully controlled professionalism. He informed the silver-haired man, in tones that had lost all their earlier enthusiasm, that he would be happy to show him their available inventory if he was still interested in viewing vehicles today. The words were polite, but carried an unmistakable chill, a subtle message that the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The executive opened his mouth, perhaps to salvage some dignity, perhaps to make excuses, but Derek had already turned away, walking toward the pre-owned section with steps that clearly expected to be followed. The message was clear. After what had happened, the newest and most exclusive vehicles were no longer being offered. The subtle demotion was more devastating than any overt punishment could have been. As Marcus and James disappeared into the consultation room, the glass door closing behind them with a soft click, the remaining people in the showroom slowly began to move again. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, but the focus had shifted entirely. The young couple by the window were whispering urgently to each other, their earlier interest in the Portofino forgotten as they processed what they'd witnessed. The other salespeople exchanged glances loaded with meaning, already composing the story they'd tell later. Inside the consultation room, the atmosphere was entirely different. The space was designed for high-value transactions. Leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent, a glass table with a surface so clean it seemed to glow, and walls that offered privacy while still maintaining the showroom's aesthetic of luxury and transparency. A coffee service had been set up, actual Italian espresso in cups that probably cost $50 each, and the subtle scent of the brew mixed with the ever-present leather smell that permeated everything in the dealership. James pulled up the transaction details on a tablet, the screen illuminating his face as he scrolled through specifications and pricing. He apologized again for the earlier situation, his voice genuine and unguarded now that they were in private. He explained that Derek was actually one of their better salespeople, knowledgeable, professional, usually excellent with clients, but that everyone had lapses in judgment, and this had been a particularly unfortunate one. Marcus waved off the apology with a gesture that suggested it wasn't worth dwelling on. He admitted that he probably should start dressing better when he came to places like this, maybe invest in a suit or at least some cleaner boots. But then he added, with that same faint hint of amusement, that part of him enjoyed seeing people's reactions when their assumptions proved wrong. It was, he said, a good reminder to himself never to make the same mistake about others. James smiled at that, a real smile this time that reached his eyes. He mentioned that some of their wealthiest clients came in wearing shorts and flip-flops, while some people who could barely afford the key fob showed up in tuxedos. You learned quickly in this business, he said, that appearances meant absolutely nothing when it came to actual buying power, and the ones who made assumptions usually ended up embarrassed or unemployed. They turned their attention to the paperwork, James walking Marcus through the final details of the LaFerrari Aperta purchase. The numbers were staggering. The base price alone exceeded $2 million, and Marcus had added numerous customizations. The seats were upholstered in a specific shade of Alcantara that had to be specially ordered. The brake calipers were finished in a unique color that required Ferrari's special paint shop in Maranello to mix by hand. The wheels were forged from a single piece of aluminum using a process that cost thousands of dollars per wheel. Marcus listened carefully to each detail, occasionally asking questions that revealed his deep knowledge of automotive engineering and manufacturing processes. He wanted to know about the carbon fiber layup process for the body panels, the specific alloy composition of the engine block, the calibration of the active aerodynamic system. These weren't the questions of someone buying a status symbol. They were the questions of someone who genuinely understood and appreciated the machinery. James pulled up images of the car on his tablet, and even on the small screen, the LaFerrari Aperta was breathtaking. The removable roof panels were stored in a special compartment. The body was painted in a deep blue that seemed to shift and shimmer in the light. And the interior was a masterpiece of Italian craftsmanship with every surface covered in leather or carbon fiber. The engine, a hybrid V12 producing over 950 horsepower, was partially visible through a glass panel, displayed like the work of art it truly was. Marcus studied the images with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every curve and line. This wasn't just a purchase. It was the culmination of years of collecting. the crown jewel of a garage that already housed some of the most significant Ferraris ever built. The LaFerrari Aperta had been limited to only 209 examples worldwide, and getting an allocation had required not just money, but relationships, history, and Ferrari's blessing. They discussed delivery arrangements. The car would be transported to Marcus's climate-controlled garage in Lake Forest, where his other Ferraris waited. James mentioned that Ferrari would send a representative to handle the delivery personally, ensuring that everything was perfect. They would review all the car's systems, explain the advanced technology, and make certain Marcus was comfortable with the hybrid drivetrain and the active aerodynamics. Outside the consultation room, Derek was mechanically showing the executive various vehicles, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. The silver-haired man had lost all his earlier swagger, his questions coming out hesitant and subdued, his gestures smaller and less commanding. He kept glancing toward the consultation room, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened, as if he was hoping this was all some kind of misunderstanding that would be cleared up. But there was no misunderstanding. The truth was crystalline and undeniable. He'd judged someone based on appearance, made assumptions rooted in prejudice and entitlement, and been proven spectacularly wrong in the most public way possible. The worst part wasn't the embarrassment, though that was considerable. The worst part was the growing realization of how many other times he'd probably done the same thing without being caught. How many opportunities and connections he'd missed because he couldn't see past surface appearances. One of the other salespeople, a young woman named Sarah with auburn hair pulled back in a professional ponytail, approached Derek and the executive. She carried a tablet and wore an expression of carefully maintained neutrality as she informed them that the Roma spider the executive had been interested in was currently committed to another client, but they had a similar model available in silver. The words were professional, but the underlying message was clear. The best options were no longer on the table. The executive's flush had returned, creeping up his neck in blotchy patches that clashed with his expensive suit. He stammered that perhaps he would come back another day, that he needed to think about his options, that this might not be the best time. Derek nodded with mechanical politeness, not bothering to try to salvage the sale, and watched as the man made his way toward the exit with steps that had lost all their earlier confidence. Back in the consultation room, Marcus was signing the final documents, his pen moving across the papers with the same deliberate precision he brought to everything. The total price, with all customizations and delivery fees, exceeded $2.7 million, a number that would have made most people's hands shake, but Marcus's signature remained steady and clear. James gathered the signed documents into a leather folder, then pulled out a small key fob, the physical embodiment of ownership for one of the world's most exclusive automobiles. He placed it on the glass table between them, the red prancing horse logo catching the light. He told Marcus that the car would be delivered the following week, on Thursday afternoon, if that worked with his schedule, and that Ferrari would handle every detail to ensure the experience was perfect. Marcus picked up the key fob, feeling its weight in his palm. It was surprisingly heavy, solid metal rather than plastic, with buttons that clicked with mechanical precision. For the first time since entering the dealership, his expression softened slightly, a hint of genuine emotion showing through the careful control. This moment, holding the key to a machine that represented the absolute pinnacle of automotive achievement, was something he'd worked toward for decades, through long nights coding software, through the risks of starting multiple companies, through failures and successes and everything in between. They stood shaking hands across the glass table, and James walked Marcus toward the exit. As they emerged from the consultation room, the showroom had returned to something approaching normal activity, but there was still a charge in the air, an awareness that something significant had occurred. Several people watched as Marcus walked past, his worn leather jacket and scuffed boots now seeming less like markers of poverty and more like badges of authenticity, evidence of someone who had no need to prove anything to anyone. At the door, James thanked Marcus again for his business and for his understanding about the earlier incident. Marcus told him, his voice carrying that same quiet authority, that no understanding was necessary because no real offense had occurred. He'd dealt with far worse than assumptions about his appearance, and in the end, the truth had spoken louder than any insult could have. As Marcus pushed through the door and stepped into the rain, still falling with that same relentless intensity, James watched him go with an expression of respect. He'd worked with wealthy clients for years, had seen every variety of nouveau riche ostentation and old money entitlement, but there was something different about Marcus Chen. It was the kind of wealth that came from building rather than inheriting, from creating value rather than extracting it, and it showed in every aspect of how he carried himself. Derek appeared at James's elbow, his face still pale and his glasses still sliding down his nose. He began to apologize again, his words tumbling over each other, but James cut him off with a raised hand. He told Derek that mistakes happened, but this one had been particularly costly, not in terms of money, though that was significant, but in terms of the fundamental principle of treating every customer with respect, regardless of how they looked or dressed. Derek nodded miserably, understanding that while he wouldn't lose his job over this, it would be a long time before he lived it down. The story would circulate through the dealership, would be told to new hires as a cautionary tale, would serve as a permanent reminder that assumptions were dangerous and appearance meant nothing. Sarah, the auburn-haired saleswoman, joined them near the window, watching as Marcus's figure disappeared into the rain-soaked parking lot. She mentioned that she'd dealt with Marcus twice before, when he'd come in for service appointments on his other Ferraris, and both times he'd been wearing similar clothes, jeans, boots, that same leather jacket. She'd learned quickly not to judge, she said, because some of their biggest spenders looked like they'd just rolled out of bed, while some people who couldn't afford the floor mats dressed like they were attending a royal wedding. James agreed, adding that this was exactly why they emphasized customer service in training. You never knew who you were dealing with until you took the time to actually engage with them as human beings, rather than making snap judgments based on superficial criteria. The Ferrari brand was built on excellence, he said, and that excellence had to extend to every interaction, not just the ones with obvious wealth. Marcus, meanwhile, had reached his car, a 10-year-old Toyota Camry with a dent in the rear bumper and paint that had faded to an indeterminate shade somewhere between silver and grey. He clicked the key fob, and the locks chirped with a sound that seemed almost apologetic compared to the sophisticated electronics in the showroom behind him. He slid into the worn cloth seats, started the engine, which coughed slightly before settling into a reliable if unimpressive purr, and sat for a moment, looking back at the dealership through rain-streaked windows. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, having just purchased a $2.7 million hypercar, sitting in a vehicle that had cost him $12,000 used and hadn't been washed in months. But that was exactly the point. The Camry got him where he needed to go reliably and without fuss. It didn't announce his wealth, didn't attract attention, didn't create expectations. It let him move through the world as just another person rather than as a target or a status symbol. He remembered his father's words, spoken decades ago when Marcus was still a kid growing up in that rough Chicago neighborhood. His father, who worked 3 jobs to keep the family fed, had told him that rich people came in 2 varieties, those who needed everyone to know they were rich, and those who were comfortable enough in their wealth that they didn't care what anyone thought. The first kind, his father had said, were usually miserable despite their money. The second kind had found something more valuable than wealth. They'd found peace. Marcus put the Camry in gear and pulled out of the parking lot, the wipers struggling against the downpour, the radio playing classic rock at low volume. In his pocket, the LaFerrari Aperta key fob felt solid and real, a promise of the experience that awaited him next week when the car arrived. But it didn't define him, didn't change who he was or how he moved through the world. It was simply another tool, another piece of engineering excellence to appreciate and enjoy. Behind him, the dealership continued its business, salespeople greeting new customers, glass walls reflecting LED lights, the scent of leather and luxury permeating everything. But something had shifted, a subtle recalibration of assumptions and attitudes. Derek would remember this day for the rest of his career, carrying the lesson forward into every interaction. Sarah would continue treating everyone with the same courtesy, validated in her approach. And James would tell the story, carefully edited to protect identities, during training sessions, using it to illustrate the dangers of prejudice and the importance of respect. The executive, who had made it to his own car, a leased BMW that he couldn't quite afford, but thought was necessary for his image, sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, staring at nothing. The rain drummed on the roof, each drop a small reminder of his failure in judgment. He thought about all the times he'd dismissed people based on how they looked, all the relationships he might have missed, all the opportunities that had passed him by because he was too busy cataloguing appearances to see actual worth. It was a bitter lesson, made worse by the public nature of its delivery. In his world of corporate hierarchies and status games, appearances had always seemed paramount. The right suit, the right car, the right address, the right schools on the resume, these were the currencies that mattered, or so he'd thought. But Marcus Chen had revealed the hollowness of that belief, had shown that real wealth, real success, real confidence needed no announcement or validation. The executive started his BMW, the engine responding smoothly because it was new and well-maintained, and drove out into the rain. He didn't know where he was going, just knew he couldn't stay in that parking lot any longer, couldn't bear to look at the dealership and remember his humiliation. Somewhere in his mind, a small voice was suggesting that perhaps this experience could be transformative, could lead to genuine change in how he viewed and treated people. But that voice was drowned out by embarrassment and wounded pride, by the defensive instinct to justify and explain rather than learn and grow. Marcus drove home through familiar streets, the Camry handling the wet roads with unremarkable competence. He lived in Lake Forest, in a house that was large but not ostentatious, set back from the road behind mature trees that provided privacy without declaring wealth. The garage, however, was something else entirely, a climate-controlled facility that held his collection of Ferraris like jewels in a vault. He pulled into the regular garage first, parking the Camry next to his wife Jennifer's Subaru Outback, another practical, unremarkable vehicle that served its purpose without fanfare. Inside the house, the smell of dinner cooking greeted him, something with garlic and herbs that made his stomach rumble. Jennifer called out from the kitchen, asking how it went, and Marcus smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face into something warm and approachable. He told her it was done. The LaFerrari was officially theirs. Delivery next Thursday. Her response was enthusiastic but measured. She'd been with him through the entire collecting journey, had watched the garage fill with automotive history, had learned to appreciate the engineering and artistry, even though she preferred her Subaru for actual daily use. She asked if there had been any issues, and Marcus considered for a moment before telling her about the executive and the assumption and the quiet resolution. Jennifer laughed, not unkindly, and mentioned that this happened to Marcus more often than it probably should. She'd been with him to enough car events and collector gatherings to see the pattern, people making assumptions based on his casual dress, then having to recalibrate when they learned about his collection or his business success. She'd suggested multiple times that he might want to upgrade his wardrobe, at least for these occasions, but Marcus had always resisted. He explained, as he'd explained before, that the way people reacted to his appearance told him something valuable about their character. Those who judged him based on his clothes weren't worth knowing, regardless of their wealth or status. Those who saw past the surface, who engaged with him as a person rather than as a walking status marker, were the ones who became real friends and valuable connections. They ate dinner together, Jennifer telling him about her day at the non-profit she ran, an organization that provided educational resources to underprivileged kids, funded largely by Marcus's success, but run entirely on her vision and dedication. Their conversation ranged from mundane details about grocery shopping and home repairs to deeper discussions about their upcoming vacation to Italy, where Marcus planned to visit the Ferrari factory in Maranello and Jennifer wanted to explore Renaissance art in Florence. After dinner, Marcus walked out to the special garage, entering the security code that unlocked the heavy door. Inside, the temperature was precisely controlled at 68 degrees with 40% humidity, perfect for preserving automotive excellence. The lighting was dramatic, spotlights focused on each car like museum pieces, which in many ways they were. The Enzo sat in the first bay, its aggressive angles and Formula One-derived technology still stunning, even though it was now over 20 years old. The F40 occupied the second bay, its red paint glowing under the lights, its twin turbocharged engine visible through the rear plexiglass cover. The 288 GTO held the third position, representing the beginning of Ferrari's supercar lineage, its compact proportions and rally-bred heritage, making it somehow more purposeful than beautiful. The fourth bay waited empty, prepared for the LaFerrari Aperta with a custom car cover and special lighting that would illuminate the carbon fiber and blue paint perfectly. Marcus stood in that empty space, imagining the car that would soon occupy it, mentally reviewing all the specifications and details he'd learned over the years of waiting for his allocation. He thought about the executive, wondering if the man would learn anything from today's experience, or if he'd simply rationalize it away as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Marcus hoped for the former, but suspected the latter. People rarely changed fundamental aspects of their worldview based on a single incident, no matter how embarrassing. But that wasn't Marcus's concern. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't control how others thought or acted, could only control your own behavior and reactions. He'd chosen to dress comfortably, to drive practical cars daily, to live in a way that felt authentic rather than performative. The fact that this sometimes led to awkward situations or wrong assumptions was simply the price of that authenticity, a price he was more than willing to pay. The next Thursday arrived with perfect weather. Bright sunshine, mild temperatures, the kind of day that made you grateful to be alive and in the Midwest when summer hadn't yet turned oppressively hot. Marcus had taken the day off from his company, leaving his team to handle things without him for once, to be present for the delivery of the LaFerrari Aperta. The transport truck arrived precisely at 2 p.m., a massive enclosed trailer pulled by a gleaming semi-truck. The Ferrari representative who accompanied it was a woman in her 40s named Isabella, originally from Milan, but now based in Ferrari's North American headquarters. She carried herself with the effortless elegance that seemed to come naturally to Italians, her accent adding music to her technical explanations. The process of unloading the car was conducted with surgical precision, the trailer's hydraulic lift lowering gently, straps being removed with careful attention, the car being rolled down ramps that had been positioned with millimeter accuracy. And then, there it was, sitting in Marcus's driveway, the blue paint seeming to glow in the afternoon sun, every line and curve speaking of speed and artistry and engineering excellence pushed to its absolute limit. Isabella walked Marcus through every system, her explanations thorough but never condescending. She showed him how the hybrid system worked, how the active aerodynamics responded to speed and driving mode, how the removable roof panels stored in their special compartment. She demonstrated the infotainment system, the track telemetry functions, the launch control that could propel the car from 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. Marcus listened intently, asking questions that revealed his deep technical knowledge, but also his respect for Isabella's expertise. They spoke for over an hour, the conversation ranging from specific mechanical details to broader discussions about Ferrari's engineering philosophy and future direction. Isabella mentioned that she rarely got to work with clients who understood the cars at this level, who saw them as more than just status symbols or investments, but as genuine expressions of automotive art. Finally, with all the paperwork completed and all the systems explained, Isabella handed Marcus the actual keys, not just the electronic fob, but also a traditional metal key that was more symbolic than functional. She told him to enjoy the car, to drive it as it was meant to be driven, to experience the full capability that Ferrari's engineers had poured into every component. Marcus carefully drove the LaFerrari Aperta into the climate-controlled garage, positioning it perfectly in the waiting bay. With the car finally at rest, illuminated by the custom lighting, he stood back and took in the complete collection. 4 Ferraris spanning decades of evolution, each representing a pinnacle of achievement from their respective eras. Together, they told a story, not just of automotive development, but of his own journey from that Chicago neighborhood to this garage in Lake Forest. Jennifer joined him, slipping her hand into his as they stood in comfortable silence, admiring the collection. She mentioned that his father would have been proud, not of the cars themselves, but of how Marcus had earned them, of the person he'd remained despite the wealth, of the values he'd maintained through success. Marcus nodded, knowing she was right, feeling the truth settle in his chest, like something warm and solid. They stood there for a while longer, husband and wife, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of automotive excellence, but more importantly, surrounded by the life they'd built together, a life based on authenticity and respect and genuine connection rather than appearance and status. The cars were beautiful, were exciting, represented tremendous achievement, but they were just objects, just metal and carbon fiber and leather. What mattered more was the lesson from the dealership, the reminder that worth had nothing to do with how you dressed or what you drove to appointments. What mattered was character, was how you treated people, was whether you had the confidence to be yourself without needing validation from strangers. Marcus had that confidence, had earned it through years of building businesses and facing challenges and remaining true to his values, even when it would have been easier to compromise. Outside, the sun continued its journey across the sky, casting long shadows through the garage windows. Inside, the Ferraris sat in silent testament to excellence and ambition and the long road from humble beginnings to extraordinary achievement. And in that moment, standing with Jennifer's hand in his, Marcus Chen felt something more valuable than the millions of dollars represented by his collection. He felt at peace with who he was and the path he'd chosen, comfortable in his worn leather jacket and scuffed boots, knowing that real worth needed no announcement or justification. The executive, wherever he was, probably still drove his leased BMW and wore his expensive suits and made assumptions about people based on their appearance. Maybe someday he'd learn differently, maybe he wouldn't, but that was his journey to make, his lessons to learn. Marcus had his own path, marked not by what others thought of him, but by what he knew about himself. And that knowledge, that certainty, was worth more than any car, any collection, any amount of wealth could ever be.